Some wounds are inflicted with words, others with silence, and some, with the cruelest weapon of all, public humiliation in front of everyone you love. This is the story of a mother who gave everything to make her daughter's dream wedding come true, only to be treated like a servant, an embarrassment, a ghost at her own daughter's most important day. But what the daughter didn't know, what nobody at that wedding knew, was that every flower, every champagne glass, every string of lights hanging above their heads, existed because of one person's credit card. And that person had just been pushed too far. This is the story of Margaret Chen. And this is a story about cruelty, silence, and a reckoning that happened so quietly, nobody saw it coming until it was far too late. Margaret Chen had raised her daughter, Victoria, alone since she was 3 years old. Victoria's father had left without warning, without explanation, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. Margaret worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. She was a medical transcriptionist during the day, a cashier at a grocery store in the evenings, and on weekends she cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods across town. She never complained. Not when her feet ached so badly she could barely stand. Not when she missed Victoria's school plays because she was working double shifts. Not when she wore the same 4 outfits for 3 years straight so Victoria could have new clothes for school. Margaret's entire life revolved around one purpose: giving Victoria everything she never had. A good education. Opportunities. A chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped Margaret her entire life. And Victoria did escape. She graduated top of her class. Got a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Landed a high-paying job at a tech company in San Francisco. And somewhere along the way she met James, a wealth management consultant whose family owned vineyards in Napa Valley. When Victoria announced her engagement, Margaret cried tears of joy. Her daughter had made it. She had found love, success, everything Margaret had dreamed for her. And when Victoria asked her mother to help plan the wedding, Margaret's heart soared. Finally, after years of sacrifice, she would be part of something beautiful with her daughter. But that's not what happened. From the very first planning meeting, Margaret noticed the change. Victoria would introduce her to wedding vendors with a tight smile and a dismissive tone. "This is my mother. She's helping out." The pause before helping out was always just long enough to sting. James's mother, Patricia, was always there too. Elegant, polished, wearing clothes that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. And Victoria lit up around Patricia in a way she never did around her own mother. Margaret tried to ignore it. She threw herself into the wedding planning, spending hours researching florists, comparing catering menus, calling venues. She took on extra shifts to contribute financially, determined to help make Victoria's day perfect. But Victoria didn't want her help. Not really. Every suggestion Margaret made was dismissed. Every idea was met with a condescending smile and a redirect to Patricia's opinion. When Margaret suggested wildflowers for the centerpieces, something affordable but beautiful, Victoria laughed. Actually laughed. "Mom, this isn't a backyard barbecue. Patricia knows a florist in Napa. We're going with imported roses." The breaking point should have come during the dress shopping. Margaret had saved for months to take Victoria to a bridal boutique. She had imagined this moment since Victoria was a little girl. Mother and daughter finding the perfect dress together, crying happy tears. Victoria brought Patricia instead. And James's sister. And 3 of her friends. Margaret found out through a photo on social media. Victoria in a stunning white gown, surrounded by laughing women, champagne glasses raised. The caption read, "Found the dress with my favorite people." Margaret wasn't in the photo. She hadn't even been invited. When Margaret called, hurt and confused, Victoria sighed with annoyance. "Mom, you're being dramatic. Patricia knows designers. We needed someone with actual fashion sense. You would have just pushed me toward something cheap." Something cheap. As if Margaret's love could be measured by a price tag. As if decades of sacrifice meant nothing because she couldn't afford designer labels. But Margaret swallowed her pain. She told herself it was wedding stress. That Victoria didn't mean it. That everything would be better after the wedding when things calmed down. So when Victoria asked her to cover the wedding costs, Margaret didn't hesitate. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask, but James and I are putting everything toward the down payment on a house. And his parents are already paying for the honeymoon and the rehearsal dinner. Could you, maybe, cover the venue and catering? It would mean so much." $85,000. That's what Victoria's dream wedding cost. The venue overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The celebrity chef catering. The live band. The imported flowers Patricia had insisted on. The custom invitations. The open bar with top-shelf liquor. Margaret didn't have $85,000. But she had good credit. And she had decades of sacrifice built into her bones. So she took out a loan. A massive loan that would take her years to pay off. A loan that would push her retirement back by at least a decade. She did it because she loved her daughter. Because she wanted Victoria to have the perfect day. Because she believed that, despite everything, Victoria still loved her too. The wedding day arrived. Margaret woke up at 4 in the morning, her stomach churning with nerves and excitement. She put on the dress she'd bought for the occasion. Nothing fancy but dignified. Appropriate. She'd spent weeks looking for something that wouldn't embarrass Victoria. When she arrived at the venue, the transformation took her breath away. The clifftop overlooking the ocean was decorated exactly as Victoria had dreamed. White roses everywhere. Twinkling lights strung between trees. A massive tent with crystal chandeliers. It was breathtaking. And it had cost Margaret everything. But when she tried to find Victoria to see her daughter before the ceremony, she was stopped by the wedding planner. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I'm Margaret, Victoria's mother." The wedding planner checked her clipboard, frowning. "You're not on the list for the bridal suite. The bride is only seeing immediate family right now." Immediate family. Margaret felt the words like a slap. But she forced a smile. "Of course. I'll just wait out here." The ceremony began. Margaret sat in the third row. Not the front row where mothers traditionally sit. The front row was reserved for James's family. Margaret sat behind distant cousins she'd never met, clutching her purse, trying not to cry. Victoria looked stunning as she walked down the aisle. Radiant. Happy. And she was being escorted by James's father. Not Margaret. Not even a friend. James's father, a man Victoria had known for less than 2 years, had the honor of giving her away. Nobody had told Margaret. She found out the moment the music started, watching a stranger walk her daughter down the aisle while she sat powerless, invisible, 3 rows back. Part 2. During the reception it got worse. The seating chart placed Margaret at a table in the back corner, far from the head table, surrounded by James's distant relatives who didn't speak to her all night. She watched from across the room as Victoria danced with Patricia, laughing, hugging, calling her Mom Number 2, during her speech. Patricia got a speech. Margaret didn't. When the toasts began, Victoria thanked everyone. The wedding planner. The florist. James's parents, with glowing words about their generosity and class. Even James's childhood dog got a mention, a joke that made everyone laugh. Margaret wasn't mentioned. Not once. Not even a passing acknowledgement that she existed. When Margaret finally approached Victoria during a quiet moment, trying to at least get one photo together, Victoria's smile vanished. "Mom, not now. I'm trying to enjoy my wedding. Can you just go mingle or something?" "Sweetheart, I just wanted." "I said not now." Victoria's voice was sharp, cold. She glanced at Patricia across the room and lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. "And can you please try not to embarrass me? Patricia's friends are here. Just keep a low profile, okay? Keep a low profile." At the wedding Margaret had paid for. At the event that existed entirely because she had gone into massive debt. Standing in front of the flowers she could never afford, under the lights she'd be paying off for the next 10 years. Something inside Margaret broke. Quietly. Completely. She walked away from her daughter without another word. Walked past the tables of laughing guests. Past the dance floor where strangers celebrated. Past the bar serving expensive champagne she'd be paying for long after everyone forgot this night. And Margaret Chen, who had spent her entire life being invisible, who had sacrificed everything without asking for recognition, made a decision. She pulled out her phone. And she made a call. The call was to her bank. To the credit card company that had processed every single vendor payment. To the company that had financed this entire spectacle. "Hello, yes, I need to report unauthorized charges on my account. Yes, all of them from the past 3 months. No, I did not authorize any of these payments. Yes, I want to dispute every single charge. Fraud. Yes, I'm certain." It wasn't actually fraud, of course. Margaret had authorized everything. But here's what most people don't know about wedding contracts. Most vendors require a deposit, usually 50%, but the remaining balance isn't typically charged until the day of the event, or sometimes even after. Margaret had been smart about this. She'd paid the minimums to secure everything, but the bulk of the charges, nearly $60,000 worth, were scheduled to process at midnight after the wedding. And Margaret had just told her credit card company to freeze her account and dispute every pending charge. But that wasn't all. Because Margaret had also been the primary contact for every single vendor. The venue coordinator had her number. The caterer had her email. The florist, the band, the photographer, everyone had Margaret's information because Victoria had been too busy, too important, to deal with boring logistics. Margaret sent a mass email. Short, professional, devastating. Due to unforeseen financial circumstances, all payments for tonight's event are being disputed. Please contact the bride directly for resolution. I'm no longer involved. Regards, Margaret Chen. Then she turned off her phone, walked to her car, and drove away. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't make a scene. She simply disappeared, just like she'd been invisible all night anyway. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. The wedding continued. Victoria danced. James gave a tearful speech. The cake was cut. Champagne flowed. Everyone was having the time of their lives, completely unaware that the foundation of the entire evening was crumbling beneath them. But at 10 p.m. the band stopped playing mid-song. The lead singer stepped off stage and walked directly to James, whispering urgently in his ear. James's face went pale. He pulled Victoria aside, confused, panicked. Within minutes, the venue coordinator appeared, then the catering manager, then the florist. All of them trying to be discreet, but their body language screamed crisis. Victoria's face cycled through confusion, anger, and then pure horror as the situation became clear. Every vendor was demanding immediate payment. The credit card charges had been disputed. The checks hadn't cleared. And Margaret Chen, the woman whose contact information was on every single contract, wasn't answering her phone. Victoria tried calling her mother. 17 times. Voicemail. She tried texting. Nothing. She sent increasingly frantic messages ranging from confused, "Mom, where are you?" to angry, "What the hell did you do?" to desperate, "Mom, please, everyone is staring, fix this." But Margaret's phone was off. And Margaret was already home, sitting in her small apartment, drinking tea, feeling the weight of decades of sacrifice finally lifting from her shoulders. Back at the wedding, the situation escalated quickly. The venue coordinator made an announcement, apologetic but firm, that due to a payment processing error, the event would need to conclude immediately. The band packed up their equipment. The caterers started clearing tables, taking back the uneaten food. The bar closed. Guests stood around confused, whispered conversations growing louder. What's happening? Is the wedding over? Did someone not pay? The humiliation Victoria had casually inflicted on her mother all night was now being returned tenfold, in front of 200 guests in real time. James's parents were furious. Patricia, the woman Victoria had praised so effusively, pulled James aside and made it clear this was unacceptable. This was embarrassing. What kind of family doesn't have their finances in order? The judgment was swift and cold. But here's where Margaret's plan revealed its true genius. Because Victoria couldn't just pay the vendors and move on. The total amount due was $85,000, and it needed to be paid immediately. In cash or certified check. Victoria and James had just spent everything on their house down payment. James's parents had already paid for the honeymoon and rehearsal dinner and made it clear they wouldn't cover someone else's financial irresponsibility. The vendors weren't budging. No payment meant they were taking everything. The flowers, the decorations, even the cake that hadn't been fully served yet. And they had every right to. Their contracts were with Margaret Chen, and Margaret Chen had disputed the charges. Within an hour, the venue was being dismantled. The beautiful clifftop wedding, the event Victoria had spent 18 months planning, was being erased as if it had never existed. Guests awkwardly shuffled to their cars. Some took photos, whispering gossip that would spread through social circles for months. Victoria stood in the middle of the chaos in her expensive wedding dress, mascara running down her face, watching her perfect day collapse. And the only person who could fix it, the person she'd ignored and humiliated all night, was gone. Part 3. Margaret didn't answer her phone for 3 days. When she finally did, Victoria was hysterical. "Mom, how could you do this to me? On my wedding day. Do you have any idea what you've done? Everyone is talking about it. James's family thinks I'm trash. We're getting sued by the vendors. You ruined everything." Margaret's voice was calm. Quieter than Victoria had ever heard it. "I paid for everything, Victoria. Every flower you didn't thank me for. Every piece of cake you didn't acknowledge. Every moment of your perfect day that you were too busy enjoying with other people to remember who made it possible. You can't just take back a gift." It wasn't a gift. Margaret's words were steel. "Gifts are given with love and received with gratitude. You treated me like hired help. Like an embarrassment. You erased me from my own daughter's wedding. So I erased myself from the bill. But the vendors, the lawsuits, we can't afford. Then you'll figure it out. The same way I figured out how to raise you alone. The same way I figured out how to work 3 jobs to keep us housed and fed. The same way I've figured out everything for the past 25 years while you've been figuring out how to be ashamed of me. Victoria tried everything. Apologies. Tears. Blame. She claimed she'd been stressed. That she hadn't meant any of it. That surely Margaret understood wedding planning was overwhelming. She begged her mother to call the credit card company to fix it to make the nightmare go away. But Margaret had already canceled the card entirely. Filed official fraud reports. Submitted documentation to the bank showing that her signature had been forged on several contracts, which was technically true. Victoria had signed Margaret's name on change orders without asking. The legal situation was complicated enough that it would take months, maybe years to resolve. And in the meantime, the vendors were going after Victoria and James. Small claims court, collections agencies, damaged credit. The very financial foundation they'd built their new life on was crumbling because they couldn't pay for a wedding they'd already had. James's parents demanded he get an annulment. They didn't want their son tied to this kind of chaos. Patricia, the woman Victoria had called Mom Number 2, stopped returning her calls. Friends who'd attended the wedding slowly distanced themselves, embarrassed to be associated with the scandal. Victoria's perfect life, built on her mother's invisible sacrifice, was falling apart. And the only person who could have helped her, the person who had always helped her, had finally decided she deserved better than being erased. Margaret didn't take pleasure in her daughter's suffering. But she didn't rush to fix it either. She'd spent 25 years putting Victoria first, swallowing hurt, accepting crumbs of affection in exchange for endless sacrifice. And where had it gotten her? Seated in the back at her own daughter's wedding. Erased from speeches. Treated like a stranger. Some people say what Margaret did was cruel. That a mother should forgive anything. That family is supposed to be unconditional. But Margaret would tell you that unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional disrespect. That sacrifice without gratitude becomes martyrdom. That sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone who takes you for granted is to let them see what life looks like without you. The aftermath was brutal for Victoria. The house they'd bought went into foreclosure within 6 months. They couldn't afford the mortgage and the vendor settlements simultaneously. James's relationship with his family became strained to the breaking point. The judgment, the whispers, the constant reminder that his wedding had ended in public humiliation, it changed him. Made him resentful. Cold. Victoria found herself working multiple jobs for the first time in her life. The tech job wasn't enough to cover their mounting debts. She took on freelance work, weekend shifts, anything to keep them afloat. And somewhere in the exhaustion, somewhere between collection calls and court dates, she began to understand what her mother's life had actually been like. The bone-deep tiredness. The constant worry. The sacrifice of dreams for survival. The invisible labor that nobody acknowledges because they're too comfortable to notice. But understanding came too late to prevent the consequences. The vendors won their lawsuits. Victoria's credit was destroyed. Job opportunities dried up when background checks revealed the financial chaos. The marriage, already fragile, began to crack under the pressure. James left 2 years after the wedding. Not dramatically, just quietly gave up. Told Victoria he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't live in the shadow of that night. Couldn't handle his family's disappointment. Couldn't afford to keep trying to build a life with someone whose mother had taught her such an expensive lesson. And Victoria was alone. Truly alone. Living in a small apartment not unlike the one her mother had raised her in. Working jobs she'd once looked down on. Struggling with debt that felt impossible to escape. Everything her mother had worked to give her, everything Margaret had sacrificed to help her avoid, Victoria had walked straight into because she'd forgotten where she came from. It took 3 years before Victoria worked up the courage to visit her mother's apartment. 3 years of silence, of pride swallowing, of growing up in ways she should have done decades earlier. Margaret answered the door looking older, smaller, but somehow more peaceful than Victoria remembered. There was a quiet strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A dignity that came from finally putting herself first. "Mom?" Victoria's voice cracked. "Can we talk?" Margaret didn't immediately say yes. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying her daughter. Taking in the changes. The exhaustion in Victoria's eyes. The absence of expensive clothes and jewelry. The humility that comes from truly struggling. Finally, Margaret stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at Margaret's small kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had paid bills by candlelight to save on electricity, where she'd eaten dinner alone for years while Victoria was too busy climbing the social ladder to visit. Victoria pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check. Not for $85,000. Victoria didn't have that kind of money, but it was a start. $2,000. Money she'd saved over months of brutal work. Money that represented real sacrifice. "I can't pay you back all at once," Victoria said, her voice small. "But I will. Every month. For as long as it takes. I understand now, Mom. What you gave up for me. What you sacrificed. And I'm so sorry." Margaret looked at the check but didn't take it. "I don't want your money, Victoria. But I owe you. You owe me respect. You owe me acknowledgement. You owe me the truth about who sacrificed what in our relationship." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "The money is gone. I made peace with that. What I need to know is if you've made peace with who you became when you forgot where you came from." Victoria broke down then. Really broke down. All the pride, all the pretense, all the years of trying to distance herself from her working-class mother, it all crumbled. She told Margaret everything. About the divorce. About losing the house. About working the same kinds of jobs Margaret had worked. About finally, painfully, understanding what her mother's life had been like. "I was ashamed of you," Victoria whispered. "And I'm so ashamed of that now. You were the strongest, most amazing person in my life and I treated you like you were nothing. I don't know if you can ever forgive me." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I already have. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean going back to how things were. It means moving forward differently." They're rebuilding their relationship now. Slowly. With boundaries Margaret never had before. Victoria comes for dinner every Sunday and she helps cook. She asks about her mother's life, really asks and listens to the answers. She's learning who her mother is beyond the sacrifices, beyond the labor, beyond the role of mom. And Margaret? She's learning to receive love without having to earn it through sacrifice. Learning that she deserves a daughter who sees her, values her, respects her. The wedding money is gone. Margaret will probably never fully recover financially. But she recovered something more important. Her sense of self. Her dignity. The knowledge that love without respect is just exploitation with a pretty name. Victoria tells this story now to anyone who will listen. She tells it as a warning. About taking parents for granted. About the cost of shame. About how easy it is to forget that the people who raised us are human beings who deserve honor, not just obligation. And when people ask if she regrets her wedding day, Victoria always says the same thing. "I regret who I was that day. But I'm grateful for what my mother taught me. She taught me that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. And that the people who love us enough to teach us those lessons are the ones we should have been celebrating all along." This is the story of the daughter who humiliated her mother at her own wedding, and the mother who quietly, methodically took it all back. Not out of revenge, but out of a deep, painful understanding that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. The truth is, we don't appreciate what we have until it's gone. We don't value sacrifice until we're the ones sacrificing. And we don't understand love until we realize it can be withdrawn, not out of cruelty but out of self-preservation. Margaret Chen taught her daughter the most important lesson of all, that parents are people too. People who deserve respect. People who can be hurt. People who don't have to accept being treated as less than human just because they're family. And in the end, that lesson was worth far more than $85,000. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below about a time someone took you for granted, or a time you realized you'd been taking someone for granted. And remember, the people who sacrifice for you in silence deserve to be celebrated loudly. Don't wait until they're gone, until they walk away to realize what they were worth. Show your appreciation now, while there's still time, while the people who love you are still willing to answer the phone.